This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Gun violence has been a rising concern in Canada over the past few years, and it is featured as an issue in the 2019 Canadian federal election. At a special speakers luncheon on October 16th, just a few days before the vote, the RCMI hosted national columnist and commentator on public security issues Matt Gurney to look at facts, myths, and misunderstandings surrounding gun control. Matt, welcome to the RCMI and welcome to the podium.
One of the pleasures of speaking to a crowd is the being introduced part, because you're always built up to be more impressive than you feel you ought to be, and then you feel you have to get up here and tell at least one joke at your own expense. I find myself very lucky today that the joke at my own expense actually wrote itself today, courtesy of my wife. In a topic completely unrelated to anything we'll be talking about today, I was reading recently from an American publication, and all these stats were American, but I think they'll be transferable here. That, as most of you probably know, marriage is considered to be good for you. Married couples, just in very generic terms, tend to be wealthier, they live longer, they have higher, self-reported happiness, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of socio-economic reasons to be married. And one of the other reasons, of course, is that it can help keep you grounded. My wife and I this morning were just comparing our schedules. She had an appointment today that got moved, and her whole day was in chaos. So she had said to me, what are you doing today? Because I might need you more than usual on the home front. And I said, pretty much a normal day for me, with the exception that I'm going to the Institute for lunch. And she said, oh, who are you meeting? I said, oh, it's a talk, it's an event. It's not like I'm not having just lunch with anyone in particular, it's for an event. And she goes, oh, who's speaking? I said, well, I'm speaking. And she goes, ugh, they're gonna be bored. So I will leave that up to you to decide, and we can take a vote afterwards and find out if I've surpassed my wife's low expectation. Thank you for having me, and obviously thank you to Eric for the introduction. Nominally, I'm here to talk guns. I think to a certain extent I'm also here to talk about human hubris, because Eric had mentioned that we had been talking about topics, what we'd want to talk about as far back as August. And it was just a couple of weeks ago, it seems longer, but it was just last month that Eric had just shot me an email and said, what's up? Has anything come up? Any changes you think we should make because we're promoting the event? And I don't remember the exact words of the email, but it was I replied something on the lines of, no, I think we're basically on track. The election's unfolding the way we thought it would. I was like an hour or two later that the blackface photos came out. So certainly this election is not necessarily the election that we were expecting to have. And before I talk specifically about the gun control element, and Eric's already done a bit of this, I should mention in general terms, because I don't think I can be specific, what the state of the race is. The state of the race is I have no idea. I have been talking to some of the parties, obviously off the record, but I think that they'll forgive me in general terms relaying the substance of what's being said. The NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives are all equally convinced that they're doing better than we think they are. Maybe two of the three are right. I don't see how all three of them can be right in combination. And at lunch, so to those who were at my table, apologies for hearing me repeat myself, the range of possibilities for outcomes come Tuesday morning is remarkably broad. I can't think of an election where, here we are a few days out, where I have so little idea of what we're going to have happen. A conservative majority government is possible. A liberal majority government is possible. Liberal and conservative minorities with enough support to be viable, at least in the short term, are possible. A liberal minority propped up by the NDP and the Greens is possible. A liberal minority or a conservative minority with no actual balance of power realistically possible in the House of Commons is possible. What does all this mean? I don't know. Normally by this time in an election campaign, and this is inside baseball stuff, a peek behind my curtain that I won't belabor the point because it won't be particularly interesting for you. I don't want to prove my wife right away. Normally at this point in the election, we would have had the ability to have put together some content that we intended to roll out the night of and the day after the election. Some articles that were partially written, and you go in and you plug in a couple of interesting facts, you put in the numbers as it comes out. As of this morning, in our conference call this morning, we have not done any of that because we have no idea. You know, I don't know how I would write my editorial 7 ways. Whoa. I could write 2 versions of it, sure, I've done that before, but 7 possible outcomes. I guess to move on, I would say at this point, waking up Tuesday morning with a majority government of one stripe or another is as likely as waking up Tuesday morning with nothing certain beyond weeks of negotiations. Israel, for those of you who follow this, is staring down the prospect of its 3rd election this year. If they can't find some sort of governing coalition, and at this time, after weeks, they have not been able to do that. They had an election, it was inconclusive. They had a 2nd election, it was slightly more conclusive, but not conclusive enough. And given the failure of negotiations, it's looking likely that they may actually return to the voters for a 3rd time. I would like to think we will not be facing that in Canada. I don't know if I have the emotional strength to do another election right now. I say this as a journalist, but also just a human being. I just don't think I have that in me. I don't rule it out. I think, barring a surprise majority, we will probably be facing another vote in the relatively near future. How likely is a majority outcome? Depends how seriously you take those margins of error. A margin of error swing one way or the other for the Conservatives or the Liberals is the difference between a majority government. If the Conservatives max out their margin of error to the high side, they have a majority, ditto the Liberals. If they both underperform, if the NDP or the Greens or the Bloc or the People's Party overperform, it's possible that we don't have a coalition of any variety. And as far as I'm concerned, if we do end up in a situation where the Parliament is hopelessly deadlocked, I mean, that will probably be the election we all deserved. And we should all go home and think hard about our many failures and do better next time. I just don't know. And I open with that to preface my other remarks, which is to say, I'm here to talk to you about gun control. But I honestly don't know really what to tell you. Because the Liberals have put forward their plan, and I'll talk about it in a couple of minutes. To the extent that we have the details of it, we can talk about that. I can tell you my thoughts. But I have no idea if the Liberal gun control as has been presented, and we still don't have a lot of the information about that. I don't know if that survives first contact with the NDP in a coalition negotiation or some other arrangement. The Liberals, as frustrated as I would imagine those of you here from the Pistol Club are with the Liberal proposals, from the perspective of the Canadian progressive voter, the Liberals actually blinked. They did not go as hard on gun control as the generic, stereotypical progressive voter might have expected. I wonder if that would be a bargaining chip in any sort of negotiations in a minority government where the NDP goes, what's this nonsense about some sort of further restrictions on handguns in cities? Let's just ban the things. That could be something a Liberal government that comes 20 or 30 seats short of a majority mandate may have to look at. So let's talk briefly about what has actually been proposed. And I'll keep this brief because I suspect all of you in the room are at least generally aware of it. What has been proposed is a buyback, a mandatory buyback in Canada with compensation, which will apparently be fair market value, I don't know what that means, for assault rifles or military style assault rifles. I think that was the exact quote in the Liberal platform. And on the campaign trail, the Liberal leader, Justin Trudeau, and other Liberal officials have used the AR-15 rifle as sort of as an example of a military style assault rifle. I do note, though, that the Liberals have set aside much more money as part of their buyback plan than would be needed to buy back every AR-15 in this country. Would a military-style assault rifle buyback include any semi-automatic rifle? Possibly. Ed and I spoke briefly before the event, and he had pointed out that, you know, when the New Zealanders announced their assault weapons buyback, a lot of weapons were included in that would not be, in any realistic description, be considered a military-style assault rifle. Would it be a narrow, focused buyback of an AR-15 rifle? And don't think this is an endorsement, but let me talk to you for a second. If I was a political operator, the Liberals might not want to spend a lot of money on a buyback, but they might see political necessity in being seen to do something, the scariest words in Canadian politics, about gun control. A buyback of AR-15 rifles, maybe a few others, could be a symbolic way of saying to the progressive voter that does not understand our gun control laws as they are and does not know the difference between any of the kind of firearms that would be impacted. It could be a way of saying to them, hey, look, yeah, we bought back the AR-15s. We're working on it, right? We're an engaged government. We're focused on public safety. Would it actually make a difference of public safety? I think all of us in this room know that it would not. Would it maybe make a difference on the fundraising circuit for the Liberals? Yeah, maybe. Would it buy them some clout in urban voters that they might think they need? Possibly. The reality of it is, and this is something that actually some researchers have been looking at, it is very difficult to find any crimes that have been committed in Canada with semi-automatic rifles. There are some, and I don't pretend to deny that. There was the attack in Quebec on the mosque. There was another attack, perhaps you remember this, going back a few elections, but when the then Quebec Premier Pauline Marois, there was an assassination attempt on her. A guard was killed, but she was not. So you can come up with incidents that happen in Canada involving semi-automatic rifles. They're very rare. What we're looking at in Canada, and this is true of our politics in many ways, and it's probably an unavoidable truth, the Canadian public understanding of the AR-15 rifle has been shaped by the American experience. I am, by Canadian standards, remarkably lax in my views on gun control. I believe in gun control. I think gun control is important, but I'm certainly, I guess we'll call it generically, to the right of the Canadian consensus on gun control. But even I look at the Americans and wonder what's going on. And so much of that experience is crossed the border. We live in an era, for better or worse, and I think it's both, depending on how you want to look at it, where a shooting in Texas, we'll call it, say the El Paso shooting a couple of months ago. In terms of how it's presented to me as a Canadian, I was up at my cottage when that happened, a couple of hours north of the city. The news reaches me as viscerally and as instantly as if it was right outside these doors in Toronto. The notion of that being a foreign story or a local story has been badly, badly eroded, and there's complicated reasons for that. But the Canadian public, I think often rightly, has been horrified by what they've seen happening in the United States, as have, of course, many Americans. But I think that has jumped north of the border. I am a cynic. I probably didn't need to confess that if you've ever read anything I've written, but I confess it nonetheless. A few months ago, I had written, I think it was in Maclean's, I'd have to go back and check that, the aftermath of the shooting, the horrific attack on the mosque in New Zealand, which was not only horrific for its violence and its death toll, but for the fact that it was streamed live. Basically mass murder as a form of internet pornography, where it was rapidly transmitted to all the darkest corners of the internet. One thing I had said right away, after it was clear that the New Zealand government was going to crack down hard on its civilian gun owners, was that Justin Trudeau was not going to be left behind. I had simply said that whatever he ultimately decides to do, he is going to have to do something. And I didn't know what it was going to be, but I knew that gun control in some capacity would be a plank in this election. Now, since then, of course, we have had an unbelievable array of political developments here in Canada. I mean, it's been a very busy year in my line of work. When the New Zealand attack happened, the SNC-Lavalin scandal had already broken. We were broadly familiar with it, but we had not had nearly the revelations that we've had now. The damage to the Liberal government was real, but it was relatively contained. Since then, of course, we've had other issues, including the aforementioned blackface. Folks, I don't think it's a coincidence that the first Liberal announcement after they regrouped, after the revelation of blackface and the Prime Minister's series of apologies, was a gun control announcement here in Toronto. It was something they had ready to go. It was in their pocket already. They'd already planned to do it, but they held it in reserve, probably originally intending to drop it later in the campaign. After the blackface incident, well, we were rolling that one out the door as the channel changer. For what it's worth, this is just my 2 cents, your mileage may vary. I don't think it worked as a channel changer. I mean, I watched that press conference live where the Liberal leader had announced the proposed gun control changes. There were a couple of, basic questions asked by the local reporters, and then just an immediate pivot back to blackface. And if you actually look at the Liberal numbers, the polling numbers in general, which I have, there was no observable improvement in Liberal fortunes after that. So I'm not sure it was effective so far as it went. But there you go, the buyback of military-style assault rifles and a vague promise to allow municipalities to further restrict or ban handguns. Eric had mentioned my column of, I think it was October 4th, he had said. He kindly did not mention the headline. Columnists in general do not write their headlines. They often get blamed for them. They don't write them. That time I did invoke editor's privilege and I did write my own headline. The headline was, "Liberal handgun proposal is breathtakingly stupid." It is breathtakingly stupid. In this country, we have known for a long time, and you will know this from officially published statistics, you'll know this if you ever talk to a police officer for longer than 45 seconds, that there are problems with lawfully owned guns in this country. Rifles, shotguns are contributors to suicides. They're contributors or involved in domestic incidents, particularly in rural areas. This has been known. But when we look at the high-profile incidents of violence we have in the city, particularly in the urban areas, particularly Toronto, those guns are overwhelmingly sourced directly back to the United States. The police have a better sense than the public appreciates of exactly where they are coming in from and exactly who is responsible. For numerous reasons, some of them good, some of them I think bad, they are not always able to act on that information. I did think it was interesting, and some of you will remember this, it was earlier in the year, maybe it was late last year, forgive me, my memory doesn't recall exactly when it was, but Toronto police, in a crackdown on a gang here in this city, not only recovered 200 handguns, they also discovered that they'd been coming in near Cornwall, Ontario, over the river into the United States, and they also, and I thought this was fascinating, they also had recovered equipment that allowed the manufacture of handguns. Not one of these newfangled half sci-fi 3D printed guns. Parts. Parts bought probably with minimal legal controls in the United States, shoved in some guy's underwear or something, driven across the border, and assembled by a relatively sophisticated gun assembly operation in the city of Toronto. There was a failure of journalistic practice in 2018, just over a year ago. The Canadian press published a story that reported that there had been a surge, that was their word, a surge in the number of guns that had been once owned by licensed Canadians that were being diverted into the criminal black market. The interview was based on the comments of one Toronto police officer given in an interview on the record to the Canadian press. I wish I could claim credit for this, but it was not my doing, but a researcher based in Alberta, if I recall, filed an information request with the Toronto police and said, I want to see the stats. And it was not a hostile request. I would just like to see the stats of the guns that have been seized by Toronto police and their origin. Most of the origin is not known because the serial numbers are easily destroyed. Can't trace a gun without a serial number. To the extent that guns were able to be traced, going back numerous years, going back about a decade, there had been no observable change in where the guns were coming from. Handguns in this city used in crimes are overwhelmingly linked back, when possible, to the United States. We have a pretty good idea of where they are coming from and then who is involved. I won't get bogged down in that. It's somewhat to the side of what we're talking about, but we do have a pretty good sense of what we're talking about and where they're coming from. The Liberal proposal to further restrict handguns in certain parts of the city is patently absurd. If we can't stop them from crossing a national border, I don't know how we stop them from crossing Steeles Avenue. What I found interesting about this, and I don't intend this as an endorsement, I'm already on the record here and also in my columns as saying I don't think the proposed military-style assault rifle buyback will meaningfully improve public safety. But I will say this for it. I disagree with the proposal, but it's logically coherent to the extent that it's an achievable goal. You say, these are now banned, we're compensating you. You don't have to agree it's a good idea, you don't have to agree it'll be effective, but it is at least from a policy perspective achievable. A partial ban in a country with free movement for its citizens, no internal police patrols, no need for papers for internal movement, is literally insane. It is 100% what the Liberals have come up with because they looked at the cost of a handgun ban and also the likely impact of it and decided it was not worth pursuing politically, but they still had to do something. And there are those two words again, as I said, the most dangerous words in Canadian politics, do something. I want to recap briefly what the other parties have said, and I will keep this incredibly brief because I can do it in a few sentences. The Conservatives have essentially argued that the status quo is basically okay. I mean, they would walk back some of the recent changes on Liberal gun control proposals, but that's what they had said. The NDP has been more consistent in simply calling for a national handgun ban. I confess, I have no idea what the Greens have said. I haven't checked it. I don't pay a lot of attention to the Greens. I wonder if I'll come to regret that come Tuesday morning. What I find remarkable about this is that the Liberals had rolled out a piece of legislation called Bill C-71. They spent about 3 years working on it. I thought there was some stuff in there, some stuff that was fine, good even. I thought there was some stuff in there that was terrible, and I thought there was some stuff in there that was just nitrogen. It was inert. It served no purpose, but it was in there to actually give them a piece of legislation to pass. But I point to Bill C-71 not as a good idea or a bad idea, but as a revealing piece of legislation. That is what our Liberal majority government thought was necessary before their political circumstances began to change. A series of reasonably modest changes, some good, some bad, to the existing status quo, but no general overhaul of the entire system. No fundamental break with the gun control as we conceived it in Canada. It was essentially, and I understand around the margins your mileage would vary, but it was essentially a continuing of what we already had. They spent years writing it, years debating it, went through all the legislative and parliamentary process to enact it into law, did so, and then suddenly realized they were declining in the polls and that gun control probably was something they could return to and maybe get a few more votes out of. As I said to you before, I'm a cynic, I'm a self-confessed cynic. I still have within me, I was delighted to find, the capacity to be surprised by the cynicism of others. I had thought that part of me long dead. The Liberal approach to gun control in this election has been unbelievably cynical. Unfortunately, I believe it will likely be effective. It will be effective at least insofar as that gun control is one of the more complicated public policy issues we have in Canada. Very few public policy issues are easy, but not many are more complicated than gun control. Before you even get into understanding gun control, you have to first understand guns as a technical object, as machines. You need to understand the difference between the various actions of handguns. You need to understand how caliber relates to gauge. I mean, the public literacy in Canada for guns is remarkably low. Not necessarily a bad thing in the abstract. Most of us probably don't need to know these things, and we can probably spend our time focused on other stuff. I understand that. Like, I'm not going to ask every Canadian to go out there and memorize the technical details of my hobby. But the problem is, and again, because of the information that comes north of the United States, north from the United States, is that the average Canadian, in my experience, and I qualify that statement, in my experience, I can't speak for yours, has formed their understanding of what our gun control laws based on the news they've seen from the United States. And one of the things that I have found remarkable ever since I bought my first gun in my early 20s, was that you find yourself in a conversation with a fellow Canadian, someone who is typically Canadian polite, but is totally weirded out by the fact that you are one of those weirdo gun owners. And they don't want to tell you you're a weird freak. I mean, they think that, but they don't want to say it. But they start kind of suggesting, trying to be reasonable, what they think Canadian gun control laws should be. And then I kind of engage with them in general terms. I'm like, well, what if it was this? Or how about we did this? Would that make you feel better? Yeah, that's totally reasonable. And what I find remarkable is that if you kind of lead them to it and tell them what the status quo already is, most Canadians are okay with it. They don't realize they're okay with it because they don't know what it is. But when you actually tell them, well, all right, I mean, hear me out. Imagine you need to have a license. You got to go through background checks for criminal and psychological issues. Your license is checked constantly. Handguns and the more military-style rifles need to be registered, and that's linked to your license. And there's strict laws about how you can store them and the kind of ammunition you can purchase, and you're only allowed to use them with special permits under very narrow circumstances. I think you'd get a supermajority of Canadians going, yeah, okay, yeah, that's fair, that's fair. And then you tell them what the status quo is, and they go, what? They had no idea. I wrote a couple of months ago in the National Post that contrary to what we were going to hear in this election, Toronto does not have a gun control problem. The overwhelming majority of the gun crimes we have in Toronto, and we have too much, is not anything that had any interface whatsoever with our existing system of gun control. It is outside of it entirely. And tweaking or enhancing or dramatically overhauling the gun control system will not bring those external problems into it. I am not a defeatist on these issues. I think we can do better than we are doing. I think there's more we can do. And I even think there are parts of our gun control system that could be reasonably overhauled, strengthened, that would have a meaningful impact on public safety. Most of what's proposed by our politicians is window dressing. Even if enacted, it wouldn't have a meaningful impact on public safety. Let me give you one small example. And it would be something that would annoy most gun owners, but I want to offer you an example of something that could have been meaningfully proposed. One of the concerns that we've heard from some of our progressive politicians, including the mayor of this city, I did 5 years ago, I'm not sure I would have described John Tory as a progressive, but here we are. One of the issues was the so-called straw purchasing. Member of a gang or someone affiliated with a gang has no criminal record. They haven't been caught for anything yet. They go through the qualifications necessary to become a restricted firearms owner. They then purchase a series of handguns under the lawful regime, and all those handguns, whoops, vanish into the black market. I don't know if that's a major concern in this country, but I don't doubt that it has happened. I'm sure there have been incidents of that. The Toronto police have said they're aware of those incidents. I believe them. What is the more logical solution? Shut down the entire handgun regulation regime in this country at a cost of anywhere from $700 million to $2 billion when you look at the buyback costs? Or do you flag unusual bulk purchases from newly licensed owners? We have the technological ability to do this within the registry. One of the other things we could do is something that is taking a lesson actually from Japanese gun control. Japanese gun control is vastly more stringent than ours. Part of it is that the police have the right to verify that you continue to possess the firearms that are registered to you. I know this would be an imposition and it would annoy people, and we would need to figure out a way to do it properly. But if we were, for instance, concerned about straw purchasing of firearms and their dissemination in the black market, want to know a really easy way to get to the bottom of this? Make any restricted gun owner once a year verify they continue to possess all the guns that are registered to them. Any absences would be noted. This is not a perfect solution, and I don't even propose it as being something that would be easily workable. But it's a hell of a lot cheaper than spending $700 million to buy them all back to address the incredibly narrow problem that perhaps out of the, I don't even know what the current number is, more than 500,000 restricted license holders in this country, that perhaps like 20 are funneling guns into the black market. I would be surprised. I was being rounding up for the sake of round numbers. I think for me, and this is where I start to kind of wrap things up here, and I have left myself deliberately time for questions, folks, because I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. People ask me, why do I care about gun control? One of the answers I give is that I am a restricted gun owner. This will impact me. But I think my answer is actually broader than that, because if I'm being honest, having my guns bought back and confiscated would certainly piss me off. Wouldn't really change my life. It would annoy me, but it wouldn't fundamentally upturn my life. Why do I care? For me, gun control, and there's a couple other issues like this, but for me, gun control is a public policy issue where I can instantly assess how serious a politician is. It is, to me, one of those little litmus tests, for lack of a better term, of how deeply you've read into these issues, how much you actually care about achieving the results you say you want to achieve, or how much of it is just political expediency in search of a quick win at the ballot box. There are some Canadian politicians who I would disagree with strongly on gun control, but they have done their homework. They understand the regime as it is. They don't like it, but they do understand it. And then there's the rest of them. I will close on this before going to questions. A colleague of mine in the news media happened to run into a Liberal cabinet minister, and this was before SNC-Lavalin. This was before certainly blackface, before some of the current debate, but it was after the shooting on the Danforth last year. And the cabinet minister, perhaps having had one or too many cocktails, began to let slip some of what the cabinet was already thinking they would run on as they headed into the next election. And my colleague, who perhaps unusually, given their own demographics, is not only a firearms owner, but a passionate firearms owner, but not a publicly known one, was able to ask a series of questions of that cabinet minister that very quickly left my colleague convinced that the cabinet, the senior most level of our federal government, did not have the slightest clue what it was talking about. They did not understand the laws as they were. They did not understand the problems they were seeking to solve, and they did not understand how and why their proposed remedies would be ineffective. What we are dealing with a few honorable exceptions notwithstanding, is not a political movement that is driven by a desire to meaningfully change public health outcomes, but by people who don't like living in a society that they think is too lax on guns. It is a personal political preference that has been dressed up in the language of public health and public policy, and is then presented to voters as a workable solution for serious problems we would all agree that we have. Gun control, and again, one or two other issues, for me, is how I quickly determine whether or not a politician has done their homework and actually means well, even if I disagree with them, or if they're just breaking my butt for a few quick votes. This election, as I've mentioned in the start of my remarks, is very unpredictable. I am putting absolutely no bets on its outcome. I would say, though, the best hope for gun owners in this country is either an outright conservative win or a completely dysfunctional parliament that is not capable of getting anything done. I would say the worst outcome would be a weak Liberal minority propped up by a strong NDP. How likely are either of those outcomes? Ask me on Tuesday.
Okay, Edgar Lou here. Two things. First one, C-71 could have an impact if it had actually been brought into law.
Mm-hmm.
It's not law yet.
Still stuck on an order paper somewhere?
That's right. There's
Yeah.
no OIC.
Yeah.
Many reasons for that, but whatever it is, it's not law. Number two, I'm going to put a proposal to you to think about this.
Mm-hmm. You know how much I hate thinking about stuff.
Well, don't strain yourself. It is an afternoon after all. But when the Liberals say, we're going to have the municipalities decide whether or not a licensed person, vetted, who has guns approved for their ownership, by the RCMP, and the RCMP is Parliament, by the way, it's not a separate organization, it is the Queen, that a municipality will decide whether or not you can have your handgun in that condition within a municipality. Is that an opportunity for what I'm going to call chaos theory to take over? In other words, we the liberals, or any party that proposed that, but here we'll use the word liberal because they thought that up, would say, we're going to give this to municipalities. Now, when you then have the gun groups and gun clubs and the gun owners and the gun retailers now in a fight with the municipality and individual councilors, have you now broken up the difference between, well, I want my shotgun for duck hunting, I want my 30-aught for moose hunting, and well, who cares? I can't do either with my handgun. That fight enacted now in the local council, and it diverts away from the federal party. And it fractures, it fractures your opposition. And I'm wondering, do you see anything of that, or are they just yapping for, like, because they're chihuahuas?
I'm not sure, in that very end of your question, Ed, I'm not sure who you meant to be chihuahuas, but I will answer yes, assuming it would cover all of them.
Yeah, the chihuahuas would be the liberals. Barking dogs.
Yeah, look, I mean, like I said, I have a very hard time ever being surprised by anyone's cynicism. I was born cynical, which was both tragic and helpful. I think there would be some of that for sure. I'm honestly not even convinced it was thought through that much. I mean, what you're suggesting though is absolutely, I mean, it would make strategic sense. If you're a nominally big tent party like the Liberals, where you are worried about rural, suburban, and urban voters, you know there's differing views among all these voting blocks about your gun control proposals. Yeah, absolutely. Pushing the actual fighting onto another level of government is a way of getting it off your plate. And there's absolute political appeal in that. Based on what I've seen from them, though, on this file of late, I honestly think it was simpler and more basic than that. They just needed something to go to the voters with. I mean, after New Zealand cracked down hard, after a series of the usual high-profile disasters in the United States, after the Liberals had already, through their own policy choices, eroded their own standing as the progressive voters, they needed something that they could sink their teeth into as a big deal. And as you full well know, and I regret now not carving out at least a minute in my earlier remarks to mention, of course, that the Liberals did do this big consultation. They went through the whole process of the public consultation, and Bill Blair was running it. And ultimately, they probably went ahead with exactly what they were already planning to do. But at the very least, they did take a look at the issue and then decided on what they've proposed here. So I think they've certainly thought about it, but my sense, Ed, is that they just wanted something splashy that fits on the little card that goes in front of the Liberal leader's lectern, and that urban voters would remember even if they didn't fully understand. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. Like I said, I'm repeating myself, but in my experience, when you tell a Canadian what the gun control status quo is, they think it's pretty good. So I think it suits the Liberals to actually speak about this in the most generic terms possible.
So, like, for instance, when Trudeau said at the last election nobody would be able to buy a pistol without showing their firearms license, I think that, 31 million or 32 million Canadians said, what a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
2.5 million Canadians who already had their license knew, well, it's been like that since '98, in fact, since '78.
Yep.
Because you had to have your FAC back then.
Yep.
It was like, okay, isn't that the crazy lie? But if you tell everybody, yeah, great idea, then they think you just invented soup.
I wish I had invented soup. I agree. That's probably the easiest way to put it. And I think, to a certain extent, and this is the only comment I'd add, then I'll take another question in a minute, is that sometimes I am curious as to whether or not this is a deviously clever strategy by Canadian politicians, or if they don't honestly know any better. In my experience, talking to people who ought to know better, they often don't. So, as a general life rule, I never assume ill intent when incompetence suffices as an explanation. And I think I'm honestly not convinced that some of what we have heard, even though it seems ridiculous, is not actually driven by a well-meaning but profound misunderstanding of what the current status quo already was. Folks, Ed and I can talk to each other for hours here. If anyone would like to jump in, please do. Please. Yeah, please go ahead.
Two questions, actually. Do you have any idea, any insight as to what a local handgun ban would mean?
Can
I got a pistol in Mississauga, and all of a sudden, how that would work? And then my second
Before you ask your second question, I'll answer the first. Zero.
Okay.
No one has talked about it, and I've been talking to lawyers about how it even could be done. I don't know. And whatever they come up with would undoubtedly be challenged through the courts at length.
Even impossible? Because the federal government, which is responsible for firearms, in our Constitution, cities don't exist. Cities are a creature of the province.
It should be impossible,
So it would be
yeah.
up to the province to decide if
Yeah.
they wanted to let a city do that.
And Premier Ford has already said in Ontario he would not.
He's like solid.
But then, in response to a question of exactly that at a press event, the Prime Minister said, "Oh, we'll make sure it's possible." So I don't know what they're planning, and I don't know if it would withstand review. But they were thinking about it. And sorry, you had a second question?
Yeah, my second question is just, again, what are the chances are this all rolls out, and then once the election is over, it all kind of just goes away, and people move on to the next thing?
Well, yeah, that's actually a great question. It's going to hinge, I think, entirely on what happens. You know, back in 2005, some of you will remember this, Paul Martin had proposed a national handgun ban. It was after the Jane Kriba shooting on Boxing Day downtown. And he lost the next election. It was the first Stephen Harper minority. And the Liberals basically didn't talk about gun control for 11 years. And I don't know if it was because they felt that the proposal had directly contributed to their loss. Maybe they thought there were other things they could do. Like, I honestly don't know. But depending on how things end up on Tuesday, it's entirely conceivable that we don't end up talking about this again for a while. But here's why I would bet against that. Two reasons, one internal, one external. Internally, the Liberals are still going to need, either in a majority government or a minority, they're going to need to be able to say, we're the progressives. They've been burned on that front already. The electoral form problem, the recent revelations about the Prime Minister's personal actions, a resurgent NDP that has bluntly done better than a lot of people thought it would do. The Liberals are going to need to show that they're motivated and energized on the left. There's a couple of things they can do to do that. You know, they'll probably figure out some way to tax a billionaire slightly more. They're talking about housing, but housing's hard. They're talking about pharmacare, but pharmacare is expensive. And I think when they start running down a list of quick wins to show how progressive they are, I think they're going to end up at gun control. And I just don't think there's a lot of other options that would be as optically good for them and as relatively cheap and straightforward. However, depending on what we wake up to Tuesday morning, I mean, I'm not trying to dodge the question. I just have no idea. It's going to depend entirely on how it shakes out. Sorry.
Now, given that most of the gun crime, or that is the result, is through the use of illegal guns anyway, would it not give the public a false sense of security if these changes were made and people thought?
I'm not sure if it would, I mean, maybe. I mean, I would describe it actually as more likely it would give them a very sincere sense of bafflement, where if we go through this entire process and if it is, as I think likely, fought through the courts, and if it becomes this high-profile political debate that drags on and on and on throughout the next few years, conceivably, depending, I mean, if we end up with a minority government, some of these court motions may get introduced and then outlast the government itself. I mean, the wheels of justice in Canada barely turn at all, let alone slowly. So if we have a 2-year minority government, but a 5-year court process, by the time we're done with it, I mean, who knows who's even in power at that point. But my gut feeling, and just play this out hypothetically here with me for a minute, folks, is that if there is a concerted effort by any government or any combination of parties in government to get this done, I think Canadian courts would permit it. I don't think the court would be the salvation of Canadian target shooters. I think it would happen. It would be sloppy, messy, only partially effective, and I think compliance would be lower than a lot of people would expect. But I think it would happen. And I think every time some guy gets blown away outside a Toronto nightclub, 3 million Torontonians would scratch their heads and go, what gives? And I think this is what's frustrating to those of us who've looked at this. I spoke to a Toronto police officer a few months ago, and I asked him, if I gave you a magic wand and I could let you put the bad guys in jail to totally clean up gun crime in the city, how many people would that be? He thought about it, and he said, I could shut down 95% of the shootings in the city by putting somewhere between 300 and 500 people behind bars. Now, 300 and 500 people is a lot in some contexts, but when you think about it, in Toronto, we have a metro area population of damn near 8 million. You take a couple of infantry companies worth of guys and you throw them in the slam, and you wipe out 90% of a problem. Now, I mean, again, I'm not naive. There are legal and logistical reasons why that's hard, and your numbers would probably vary depending on which precise cop you were talking to. I grabbed the one I happened to be at a cocktail party with, so it was a sample size of one. But that sounded to me about right. And, you know, what we're dealing with here in Toronto, and I don't pretend to be an expert in all the other cities, but I'm given to understand it's generally similar in Vancouver as well, is that we have a very small number of organized, well-defined gangs, and the shootings are retaliatory violence. It's not even per se, as many would think, to control drugs, to control prostitution, women, to control illegal business enterprises. It's mostly, from my understanding and from what I've been told by police, it is mostly driven by personal rivalries and retaliation. How do you shut that down? Well, you arrest them. I did think it was interesting that Chief Saunders of the Toronto Police had said just a couple of days ago, one of the main issues he faces is not even arresting the bad guys, it's preventing the bad guys from getting out on bail. Yeah.
In Toronto, we have a bail program that's starting to address that. And, but the Supreme Court has had issues with that.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem being that there's only 3 or 4 of the gun criminal charges that are reverse onus.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not reverse onus, then the Supreme Court of Canada has said they will be released.
Mm-hmm.
Reverse onus basically is trafficking in firearms or importation of firearms.
Yep.
Not much else does that. One of the things that I have proposed and gotten a lot of support from police, crown attorneys, members of parliament, but they don't seem to want to do it, is to take the prohibition orders that exist in the criminal code, they exist under several sections of the criminal code, and basically say that a person has a prohibition order that they must report where they live if they move within 30 days, like I did. That it might go a little further to say that any house, any dwelling, say, any vehicle that they are in can be searched like that.
Yep.
For firearms. That would split the person who is on bail or under a prohibition from associating with their other gang friends because they become basically a liability that's radioactive. I get a tremendous amount of support for that, but I've yet to see anything like that come through or even be proposed because, and I don't understand why, because the other thing we find from being around the criminal courts is that many people with prohibitions who are gangsters still are well armed, and they're charged with breaching their prohibition, and that seems to get them like 30 or 60 days.
I don't know, I'm not sure there was a question there that I could answer, but I certainly said I would agree with you. And I would say as well, one of the challenges we would have to face, and it would be meaningful if we could do this, would be to either through reverse onus or some other legal mechanism, I'd leave that to guys like you to come up with, but would be for not simply importation, but for possession. Because every importer can arm 100 guys. So if you get an importer, that's great. I mean, you can choke off the supply. One thing I would notice, and Eric's hovering protectively, so I suspect my time is nearly at an end here.
Your time is nearly at an end.
My time is nearly at an end. I would say this, one of the most interesting things I found is that in my conversations about the broader issue, without even getting into the details, is that there is a tremendous degree of overlap between the people who seem to think that we need to have a very open mind between the legalization or at least the decriminalization of various classes of drugs because of the complete and proven failure of prohibition, who seem to have remarkable faith that it would work with guns. And I don't know precisely how you deal with that. I think, you know, and Ed, you would know this, you know where these guns are coming from. It's understood. We know how they're getting in, we know roughly what their street value is, double to triple what you'd buy them for with an actual license.
Generally 2,000 each.
Yep. We were also seeing guns being seized by police from gang members that are recent model firearms, things that have only ever been produced after the current gun control regime in Canada came into effect, which means, for those who might not be as familiar, there is zero legal standing for them to have ever been in the country. So the notion that it was stolen from some target shooter's pistol locker is literally impossible. You would not have been able to legally import it. So we know these things are coming in illegally. We also know that they're being rented, where, you know, if you need a gun for a night out on the town, you can rent one for a few $100, and it's fairly well understood how to do it. One of the media outlets in this town just a couple of weeks ago decided to do an investigative story. How quickly could one of their reporters, and I know the reporter, she's a lovely young woman, how quickly could she obtain a gun? She thought the assignment would take a couple of days. That's what she pitched to her producer. I think it was 3 or 4 hours. And the transaction was not in some seedy warehouse. It wasn't in some alley at nighttime. It was a strip mall in suburbia with a guy who basically had a mobile gun shop in the trunk of his car, dealing in cash business. You want to buy, you want to rent, whatever, your word is good. There's people out there who think we're going to stop that from happening, but also think we need to decriminalize hard drugs because prohibition will never work. I don't know exactly how to explain that kind of cognitive dissonance, but I know it when I see it. To spare Eric any further stress, I will take one more question if there is one, and if not, I will thank you all. I will vanish very quickly after this is over, folks, if only because I'm on a deadline today. I'd mentioned my wife's schedule is blown up today, so kid pickup duty is my job today. So I will depart rapidly after I'm done, with apologies. Normally I'd like to stick around and chat a bit more, but a last question if there is one. Please.
In light of the crimes and the descriptions of the murders, attempted murders over the past couple of months, including the young schoolboy who was killed in Hamilton, do you envision some rationally challenged leftists putting forward that we should have a ban on knives, such that you would require a knife acquisition certificate, you would go through a test to prove you need to carve a roast, or slice a loaf of bread, or butter a piece of toast, and then you could prove that your kitchen drawer had a lock.
You know, it's funny you mention that, because you're looking at a man who just yesterday had to go out and buy a new multi-tool because I tried to go into a sporting event and I forgot it was in my pocket. So the staff at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit, where the Leafs beat up on the Red Wings on the weekend, are now proud new owners of my multi-tool. It didn't even occur to me. Left it in my pocket when I crossed the border. Wasn't a problem crossing the border. Getting into the damn rink was the problem. Yeah, I could see that. But I think there's an interesting reason why we might not. And I know no one in this room, particularly licensed gun owners, are probably looking forward to hearing me say nice things about liberals. But I do want to say something I may be damning with faint praise, but it's praise nonetheless. They did pull their punch. And I don't know if they'll be pulled into more by the balance of power in a minority parliament. But I actually thought they were going to go for the full national handgun ban. When they came out with the watered down version of the increased local restrictions, I was genuinely surprised. And I was surprised, if only because from the narrow liberal perspective, a national ban is good politics. I'm not saying it's good policy. It's only a couple of letters worth of difference in those words, but it's a big difference between politics and policy. It's good politics for the Liberals to go for the national ban. And I was impressed to a limited extent that they chose not to do it. And I don't know if they were deterred by the costs of a buyback of almost 1 million handguns, and all the related equipment, magazines, storage lockers, reloading equipment, etc. That's why the cost estimates are so variable, anywhere from 700 million to over 2 billion, who knows? Maybe they didn't like the price tag, maybe they didn't like the effort, maybe they thought it would be ineffective, I'm not honestly sure. But they did pull that punch, and that's why I would hope something like a knife ban would not be looked at. I will mention this, and this will be my last remark before these guys jump in. My wife is a teacher, and I had opened up my remarks, or near to the start, by saying that we're never going to make progress if we're looking at the wrong problem. Toronto does not have a gun control problem, it has a gang violence problem. You mentioned the stabbing of that young man at that school in Hamilton. That school in Hamilton was the very same school where my then university-aged girlfriend, not wife, not even fiance yet, did one of her first teaching sessions as a teacher-to-be, as a classroom assistant. When that news story broke, she saw the name of the school, not surprised. She said, oh yeah, right away, that bad school. No, guy got knifed there, for sure. We are very bad at this country at solving the problems that are right in front of us. We're very, very good about coming up with solutions to the problems that could probably wait a little bit. We're not even all that great at enacting those solutions, but we do come up with them. So would we look at that? Possibly. I tend to think there would be some resistance to it, but you know as well as I do, if we did, it wouldn't really matter, would it? I heard the beep of the camera, a little dramatic ending to my remarks.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry to have to cut this short. We're going to get Matt into terrible trouble. The only thing I'll say before I ask the President to thank him is that you've set me a nice conundrum. Do I air this before or after Election Day?
I'll leave that to you, but depending on how it goes, it may be worth repeat viewing.
So, Matt, the official job of thanking you on behalf of the Institute and the members here today and falls to me. Your cynicism has been most refreshing. And I think we could all go back and tell your wife that she doesn't quite assess you correctly, that you didn't bore us.
I'll take your word for that.
And that you did provide us with some rather interesting information, your prognostications about the election, which basically summed up, you haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've covered every possible angle on the election.
And of course, all you had to say about guns and related issues. So thank you very much on behalf of the Institute. We have here what we refer to as the sacred beer mug.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.